everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and a very warm welcome to this PeaceCon session entitled Revisiting Innovative Financing for Peacebuilding. I just want to mention that we're recording this session, and along with all the other PeaceCon sessions, it'll eventually find its way onto the Alliance for Peacebuilding website. So that's a good reference resource for this and other sessions. My name is Mark Clark. I'm the CEO of Generations for Peace, which is an international peacebuilding NGO focused on grassroots conflict transformation. We've been programming in about 51 countries over the last 15 years. So we're very much dedicated to grassroots engagement in very diverse contexts around the world, supporting volunteers in communities from our headquarters team in Amman. So in this conversation, I'm very much not the expert, but a very curious explorer. And this session is really an invitation for the audience to explore with me, with the benefit of our expert panelists. I'm calling in from a very wintry Amman. Here in Amman, we've had about 12 inches or 30 centimeters of snow overnight. So as I introduce the session, I'd really love if we can get visibility on who is listening. So you may see in the chat an invitation, please, for you to just type your name, your organization, and the country that you're calling in from. And that would be great for our panelists to see the diversity of the audience. So thanks for doing that. To frame the session, I think the thematic focus of this year's PeaceCon around COVID, with COVID lockdowns and restrictions, lots of disruption, lots of challenges for people-to-people peacebuilding engagement, but also lots of innovations and huge resilience shown by peacebuilding organizations all around the world. And I think a lot of organizations adapting and racing to digitize their engagement, but also facing very significant financial impact of COVID. And our concern is perhaps the financial impact of COVID is going to have quite a long tail to it, longer than the emergency pandemic itself, and that it could still be an extinction event for many peacebuilding organizations, especially the smaller ones. Alliance for Peacebuilding's own research showed the devastating financial impact of COVID on peacebuilding organizations' funding. And so I think it's a time when peacebuilding organizations need to examine every possible innovation, every possible alternative source of funding. And in the peacebuilding sector, there have been some previous initiatives to explore establishment of peace bonds and to look at other forms of alternative or innovative financing. And also over recent years, beyond the peacebuilding sector, there's been a rise of results-based financing models, impact bonds, and other forms of impact financing. And these seem to be accelerating. So I think this panel is a really timely opportunity to revisit impact bonds and other forms of innovative financing, and to see what may be useful, what may be applicable for our peacebuilding sector. I'm extremely honored to be in pretty stellar company on the panel today. As we go, and I'll be introducing the panelists presentation by presentation, but as we go, please do type questions in the chat, and we're then going to come back to the questions after all four panelists have presented. So first up, I'd like to wish a very warm welcome to Dr. Emily Gustafsson-Wright. Emily is Senior Fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. Her focus on effective delivery of social services, including education and health interventions in developing countries, has really consolidated her role as something of a global expert on innovative financing mechanisms, including payment by results, public-private partnerships, and impact investment. So she is going to help us frame the conversation and share with us what she has learned from cultivating a database of more than 220 and counting impact bonds worldwide across quite diverse sectors. And her experience also she'll share about other forms of impact financing. So very warm welcome, Emily, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mark. And it's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to all of you for joining. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, as indeed it's peace building is a new topic for me. So today I will talk a little bit about a particular form of innovative financing, social and development impact bonds. I'll start off now by sort of giving a sense for where impact bonds fit in the broader innovative financing landscape, and then talk a little bit about how they work, how they're being used currently, and then we'll think together a little bit about how they could be used potentially in the peace building space. So starting with sort of a broader innovative financing landscape, I like to think of innovative financing in kind of two categories. One is innovative sources of financing, and the other is innovative delivery mechanisms, so innovative ways of delivering the actual funding. You can see on the innovative sources side of the table, we have things like sin taxes or airline taxes, CSR, carbon auctions. Those are different types of innovative sources. On the innovative delivery mechanisms, we split that into two different categories, disbursement that's non-contingent and contingent disbursement. So non-contingent disbursement would be things like bonds and notes, risk guarantees, concessionary loans, also unconditional cash transfers. And then on the contingent disbursement side, we have different forms of results-based financing, results-based aid, prizes and awards also go into that category, conditional cash transfers, and social and development impact bonds, which we'll be talking about today. So what is an impact bond? So I usually describe it as
Emily, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt. I'm seeing a blank white slide, and I'm wondering if others are also seeing blank slides. Can somebody give us some feedback?
I see the correct slide.
You see the correct slide with detail?
Yes.
Very good. Okay, must just be my problem. Sorry, Emily, please go ahead. Thank you.
No problem. Great. Please, anybody put in the chat that if you are having any issues, and we'll ask our tech folks to help us out. So the way that I usually describe impact bonds is that they're sort of a confluence of three things. One of them is impact investing. So that's when investors are looking to see both a social and a financial return, a public-private partnership, and payment by results, or PBR. So impact bonds sort of sit at the intersection of those three things. So how do they work? So this is sort of a very simplified diagram. There are a number of other actors that are involved, which you'll see in the following slide when I give an example, but this is sort of the simplified version. So what happens is that an investor, usually an impact investor, provides risk capital to a service provider to deliver some type of services to a population in need. And then an independent evaluator verifies whether or not some pre-agreed impact metrics have been achieved. And then the outcome funder, the so-called outcome funder or outcome payer, pays the investor back their principal plus some return. You heard me mention social and development impact bonds. So in the case of a social impact bond, that outcome funder is government. In the case of a development impact bond, or DIB, that outcome funder is a third party, such as a development agency or a foundation. That term was sort of developed with the idea that potentially in developing country contexts, government might be unwilling to be an outcome funder. The terminology in this space is a little bit messy and confusing. The other very important point to note is that impact bonds aren't actually bonds. In some countries, they're called pay for success. In the US, it's called pay for success mechanism. In other countries, they're called outcomes contracts. Australia, they're called social benefit bonds. So there's a variety of terms, but basically the idea is to be paying for outcomes, and you have these investors that provide the upfront risk capital and have the potential to get not only paid back for the amount that they've put in, but also some return if and only if outcomes are achieved. So that's the contingency that I was talking about earlier in terms of contingent payments. You also have a number of other actors, and you'll hear from, in fact, one of those actors later on in this session. You have intermediaries who can help to sort of put the deal together. You also have performance management intermediaries that often work with the service providers. There's often a or multiple legal teams that are involved because of the contracting between the different parties. And I mentioned the evaluator. So that's sort of the simple breakdown of how it works. So here's an example. I chose an impact bond that I thought would be the closest to the peace building sector. This is an impact bond, refugee impact bond in Jordan and Lebanon, which serves about 11,000 mostly Syrian refugees, as well as vulnerable host populations in urban and peri-urban areas. You can see there are multiple interventions and multiple outcomes that upon which payments are made. So you can see in this diagram, you have in the top, you have DFC and FERD who are the investors. In this case, in their model, they call them the lenders. Indeed, they are lenders, but also should be considered investors. And then you have the delivery partner, the Near East Foundation. The outcome funders are IKEA Foundation, Novo Nordisk Foundation, and NORAD. And then you have the DIB coordinator. I mentioned the sort of intermediary party who helps to sort of coordinate everything. And then there's also an independent evaluator. So that's just quite kind of a quick example of one impact bond and sort of how it works. Of course, that's sort of a high level, but to go in a little bit to detail of what is the landscape of impact bonds look like. So as Mark mentioned, there are over 220 impact bonds in the world. We've been maintaining a database of all these impact bonds since 2014, which is a big job, and we're constantly chasing folks to keep track. The market, is moving relatively quickly, and there are impact bonds all over the world, as you can see from this map. 206 of those impact bonds are social impact bonds. Again, that's where the outcome funder is government, and then about 15 are development impact bonds. Notably, there are also social impact bonds in middle-income countries, and so these are spread across 37 countries, and you can see the countries on the map that are highlighted that have the darkest coloring are those which have the most impact bonds. So that's US and UK are the ones with the highest number. And then Portugal, Netherlands, Australia, also, and Canada. So where are we seeing most impact bonds globally? The majority are in the social welfare and employment sectors. Social welfare includes things like homelessness, poverty reduction, child and family welfare, and then after that we have education, health, and then education as the two most prominent sectors. Just to give a sense of sort of what these look like in terms of size and how long they last. So the average contract duration is about 52 months. The average upfront capital is about $3 million US. The sum to date, with some missing data, but this is sort of the average, I would say, about 500 million or billion dollars, US dollars. And then the average number of beneficiaries is almost 12,000, but notably half of impact bonds that have been contracted serve less than 500 beneficiaries. And then in developing countries, there are 21 impact bonds, and the majority of those are in the employment and health sectors, followed by education. So if you're thinking about engaging in impact bonds, I think there are some important questions that you need to ask yourself. And I like to start with this sort of decision tree, kind of, this is a nice starting point. So the first question to ask yourself, I mean, even before I think you look at this decision tree, the first question to ask yourself is what is the problem that we're trying to solve? So what's not working, right? And then I guess after that is the question is paying for outcomes more likely to get you those outcomes than paying for inputs? So if paying for inputs is working well at getting you those outcomes, definitely do not go into payment by results or outcomes-based financing. But if that is a possibility, the next question to ask is, do service providers need this upfront risk capital? And is there also some potential for some capacity building in terms of the service delivery? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And so if the answer is yes to those questions, then impact bonds might be an appropriate choice. And if not, some traditional payment by results mechanism might be more appropriate. And I think we might hear a little bit more about that from Sebastian. So what is it about impact bonds? We sort of talk about kind of like what's the value add of impact bonds, and this goes into a little bit those last questions in the second part of the decision tree. And so the main thing about impact bonds, the form of outcomes-based financing, is this sort of shift to an outcomes focus. And the outcomes focus really leads to time investment of all the stakeholders, because they have to determine the metrics, right? So you have these metrics upon which your payments are being made or not made, right? So these metrics have to be determined in the design of the impact bond. And then also this outcomes focus really allows for service providers to have flexibility to innovate and tailor to beneficiary needs. The upfront capital provides liquidity for that's needed during to deliver services, and also that flexibility to innovate. The investor engagement really means greater attention is placed on service delivery during implementation, and really has the possibility of improving capacity among service providers, as well as the other stakeholders are involved. And this leads to more adaptive management. And then finally, sort of, being this new, we're 11 plus years in, but I still think it's sort of seen as a new mechanism. There's quite a bit of scrutiny on the project because, everybody is sort of all eyes on this project. And so the stakeholders that are involved tend to be very closely engaged and, very invested in ensuring that those outcomes are achieved. So those are sort of things to think about. What can impact bonds bring to your project? We wanted to talk about the idea of outcomes and thinking about outcomes in peace building. So in a minute, we're going to ask you, and Sarah from my team is going to put into the chat a link to this poll, which you can put either into in your browser on your computer or on your phone, and then enter Sarah Osborne, Sarah with an H, Osborne with only an O and no U. You can also text Sarah Osborne 412 to the number 37607. And then text in your message. And so we're going to ask you to do, and you can think about this for a minute as I talk about some outcome examples from other sectors. Think about what are the outcomes that you want to be seeing in the peace building sector. So some examples of outcomes from other sectors include sustained employment for 6 months, for example, because in the employment sector, for example, it's tended to be sort of the only thing that was measured was with whether or not somebody was employed. Well, we really want to know if somebody's employed for a longer period of time. In the education sector, an increase in learning outcomes, and in the health sector, an example could be number of dropouts who are re-enrolled in HIV treatment, housing, sustained stable housing for a year. And then in the criminal justice sector, offenders remaining out of incarceration. So, so think about what are the outcomes that you would like to see in the peace building sector. Sarah is going to take over the screen and share some of the responses that are coming up. I'm really excited to see what outcomes you all are thinking of, since this is not my sector of expertise. An increased sense of belonging among marginalized youth. Reduction in gender-based violence. Psychosocial well-being in vulnerable populations. I see in the chat increase in trust. So as you continue to put these in, I think it'll be interesting to think a little bit about, again, as I said, this is not my sector of expertise. I would be really interested in hearing sort of what tools are used to measure these types of outcomes. So something we talk about sort of in the impact bond space or the outcomes-based financing space is that it tends to be appropriate where sort of the inputs are very complex and the outcomes are more simple to measure. So employment is obviously a pretty easy one to measure, and length of employment. In some sectors, those outcomes might be more difficult to measure, but I'm guessing that in the space you have some of those tools. I assume that there are sort of like self-reported tools that, you know, where they're self-reporting in terms of feeling of belonging, etc. So thank you all for putting those in, and I look forward to having this discussion further. So thank you. We'll go back to the final slide. Great. All right, perfect. So we just talked about sort of, is it the right tool as far as, you know, is it a tool that could potentially solve the problems that you have? But there are other things to think about as well, as far as legal feasibility. So for example, can outcome funders actually pay for outcomes? Political feasibility, will outcome funders or, you know, other stakeholders that are involved, you know, is this feasible from a political standpoint? There has to be administrative capacity on the outcome funder side, obviously service provider capacity, availability of data or measurable outcomes, as we were just talking about. And then finally, and very importantly, I think the presence of committed champions. So that's a quick summary of sort of what impact bonds look like, what some things you might consider if you were to engage in this space. If you're interested in more research, I think Sarah put in the chat a link to our webpage that has a number of reports that we have published on this topic. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Emily, thanks so much. That was a really superb introduction to frame your research and the database and everything you've learned from it. I was struck by a couple of things. One was the diversity. I was particularly struck when you looked at the scale. Some of them were smaller than I had expected. I think I had this expectation that to do this, you had to do it at scale, otherwise it wasn't worth doing. So I was quite encouraged that some of the current impact bonds are actually a bit smaller than I had thought. I love the decision tree. I think that's particularly useful for all of us to get to grips with and sort of walk ourselves through for our own organizations and different types of programming or value propositions that we might have. And I think just the poll exercise and sort of making visible, even just with the very short responses, the variety of outcomes in the peace building field, there's such a huge spectrum of different ways of interpreting what is peace building. And I think the invitation is for us to really consider how do we get over that instinctive sort of resistance that, peace building outcomes are too woolly, too vague, not measurable enough to be amenable to impact bonds or results-based financing. And I, for one, think that problem is solvable. And when we look at the outcomes that were listed there, I think there are means of measuring those sorts of outcomes with both quantitative and qualitative data. So part of it could be us doing more work as a field to overcome the perceptions and to demonstrate that we're actually quite sophisticated and quite effective now as a field in measuring these sorts of outcomes. So I think that's a really good start. We're well warmed up. Next up, it's my pleasure to welcome Darshita Gillies. Darshita serves on the board of Business Plan for Peace and is a founder and CEO of Manch, a multi-award-winning global impact information management system for investors, corporates, and the philanthropy ecosystem, working with more than 700 partners across 30 countries. Darshita is an investment banker, an executive coach, a fintech blockchain specialist, an ESG and impact evangelist, and chartered accountant. We'll forgive you for being a chartered accountant. The rest sounds very exciting, Darshita. And she's listed as one of the top 100 influencers and also one of the 100 most meaningful business leaders. So we're in really good hands with a different presentation, presenting really the so-called business plan for peace and experience of conversations to ideate a peace bond. So very warm welcome, Darshita, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining this session. I don't have slides, but I have a lot of insight from the work we have done and are doing at Business Plan for Peace and at Munch. To just give you a brief insight, Business Plan for Peace was founded by Dr. Scilla Elworthy. She's been nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. And the reason why I joined the board at the Business Plan for Peace was because of its game-changing mission is to see a world without conflict in our generation. And to build something like that and to create a groundswell of people and organizations who support in that mission requires not just a very good team, which we have in-house, but we also require a collaboration from the sector as well. So what you'll hear from me today is, I would say I'm going to give away the last line right at the beginning. The key thing you're going to hear from me, and I'm going to validate it through many different viewpoints, is the game-changing way in which we can really finance the peace building sector is through game-changing collaboration. And I'm going to emphasize that in different ways as I share my insights. Whilst I'm also on the board of Philanthropy Impact, I run a tech company called Munch. Munch means platform. And when I started Munch, my primary vision was to build data systems that allow investors, philanthropists, businesses to match up with impact partners so that they know when they're making a financial decision, it is inclusive of the impact they want to see happen in the world. And to this day, the vision remains the same. Just how we execute it has morphed as we have received feedback from the sector. And I think when I'm looking at nonprofit space, when I'm looking at NGOs, when I'm looking at grassroots organizations, there are, I would say, three biggest challenges that sort of really almost like circle through or almost run through pretty much any and every organization, especially in the peace building space. The first challenge is fundraising. How do you have a consistent stream of funding to deliver on the projects that you know are going to change lives? And how do you as an organization spend more and more time doing the things that actually build peace, rather than more and more time in actually spending time on acquiring the funds? So that's one challenge that we know is a sector-wide challenge. And I would argue to say that it's not just a peace building challenge. It's becoming a challenge across non-profits. And we also see trends in fundraising as well, which is not ideal for the sector. So we now see a lot of funding being diverted to climate change. And so I think whichever problem has got the buck gets the funding. And so we're starting to see this trend happening in the nonprofit space. Underlying the fundraising challenge are two challenges, especially for local NGOs or local or grassroots, especially organizations, is due diligence. Because there are lots of individuals, and I speak with philanthropists, and I speak with foundations, I speak with corporate organizations as well. They want to fund initiatives on the ground, and they cannot yet find a way to get the due diligence piece right, and because there is a lot of risk in funding outcomes on the ground. And most organizations that want to play safe or don't want to do that extra work tend to give to local programs or local organizations, and then the funding goes to the admin rather than funding the outcomes. So this is something that we know is a challenge, and we need to unlock this challenge to further support easy and fast funding across grassroots, because there is the willingness and there is the capital to go direct to the grassroots. But there is an administrative layer which gets in the way. And then the third challenge also that underlines for that's prevalent for most NGOs, and increasingly so, is how do you quantify the impact you have as an organization? And because and we see that also from the peace bonds and various other outcome-based funding models, that you do need to demonstrate and verify or give proof that you have had impact. So how do you, and these are all very costly and time-consuming challenges. So my suggestion for overcoming this challenge, which is a sector-wide challenge, is to really inspire amongst peace-building organizations, especially, to think about what could you do to solve these challenges that are almost central to all of you, in a way that really unlocks the capital for all of you. And these kind of challenges, I think, call for collaboration. So I'll take a pause at this challenge piece, and then I'll move from challenge to outcomes and opportunities, and why, again, collaboration is key. And what can happen and what can be fostered if these challenges are taken care of, and also like other non-tangible ideas that can also enable more funding and unlocking of financing to the peace building sector. So firstly, if we address the challenges, I think the outcomes we can see is speed. So if you as an organization are due diligence ready, you have your organizational records in one place, they can be verified and proofed by an independent evaluator. If your financials are in place and can be again reviewed and verified, and if your impact methodology and scorecard is in one place, and then what this does is it enables speed, because you're not spending time again and again trying to build trust, build value, and demonstrate that. So I would say the first thing that can really unlock speed and volume of capital is to take care of the things that continuously get in the way, and create a collaborative system to unlock that capital. And then a slightly more subtle, but also important, and I mentioned this earlier about trends in funding. I think we tend to narrate the challenge of peace building efforts with war and or conflict. And I think there is an opportunity here to also look at it not just through the lens of war and conflict. I think as we move into climate change and many communities being at the risk of being impacted due to weather changes and various other reasons that climate change can bring about, I think there is an opportunity to build resilience in the communities and actually create migration plans. And I think peace building efforts can really be used also in the climate space and climate agenda. So I think there is, and I'm just giving that as one example. I think if you pick any other topic, there is an opportunity to re-narrate, to reframe peace building into the narrative of it's actually building human capacity, human resilience, and community. And this is something that we know the world needs a lot, and there's a lot we can learn. And we're already seeing that with the work we're doing with Plan for Peace, that when it comes to peace building, it's not just in fragile nations that peace building efforts are needed. Corporates have conflict, corporates have challenges, and the skills that a lot of peace building organizations offer actually give humans working in an everyday city context the skill sets that they can use to have much more peaceful coexistence with their colleagues. So I think there is an opportunity to apply your methodology, your model to a broader stakeholder base, and that can also unlock finance from other sources that previously you had not thought would be accessible for your programs. And I could go on if I can have time, like 2 minutes, to give some more examples.
I think we're up on time, but let's see what questions come, and we can come back to you later, great. Darshita. I really want to thank you. I've got 3 takeaways already from what you covered. The third one was narrative change, and I think there've been so many other sessions in PeaceCon on this topic. You've really hit something important, and that's for the whole field, the whole sector. We need to address how we can be better at cutting through the noise with a narrative that is more accessible and not just an echo chamber within our kind of technical bubble. Your invitation to really push on game-changing collaboration, and for me, the reflection is that means we've got to break out of our bubble, break out of our comfort zone, and make different and new connections, and maybe cultivate new ecosystems. And so we might be coming back to you, Darshita, for some guidance in that. But I think we've got to get beyond the normal. Yeah. And lastly, the barriers to entry of the due diligence and of proof of impact. And I think this is a continual struggle, but these are solvable. And in a way, it's a nice segue to our next presenter, Dr. Catriona Gourlay, who's Executive Director of PeaceNexus, because PeaceNexus is probably best known to all of us as being a unique organization focused on organizational capacity development of peace-building organizations. Catriona has been also heavily involved in the development process, which led to the launch of the Cadmos Peace Investment Fund in early 2018. And that's an investment fund which has shown returns of 30.4%, outperforming the MSCI World Index by 4.2%. So it shows that sound investments in peace can actually outperform the rest of the market. Catriona will also touch on other examples of innovative financing, such as examples of impact bonds and the Peace Dividend Initiative. So very warm welcome to you, Catriona, and over to you.
Thank you very much. So as Marcus just said, so obviously PeaceNexus does actually provide grants and technical services, and we use money for that, obviously. So what I'm going to talk about now is not our grant making, but how we make the money that we then spend on grant making. So we're privileged to be an endowed foundation. And so what the problem we initially started with was how can we have a mission-aligned investment? So we want financial returns in order to support our partners, but we also want those to be as closely aligned with the peace-building mission as possible. And so I just want to warn you, our experience is as an investor rather than a grantee. And so this is not necessarily going to give you a great, a new revenue stream into your operations, but that's where I'm coming from. And so I think what I want to start with is if you're a mission-aligned investor, you're obviously trying to get returns on your investments. So that's a given. And as Emilia said, what you're also interested in doing if you're mission aligned is having some impact. And I just want to start with kind of laying out the different types of investment in line with different asset classes as an investor that you can have impact with. So firstly, if you're an impact investor, and this has been mentioned by Emily and will be spoken to again, generally, what the problem you're trying to solve is market failure. In other words, where the money is not flowing to the companies that could use it well. So that could be because they're in very high-risk places, post-conflict, for example, or they're small and young companies. There are all sorts of failures. So basically, what one impact you're trying to do, one impact is actually growing companies that have a positive impact on peace, either just, because they're not doing any harm and they're providing gainful employment, or actually through the products that they develop. There are a number of ways you can have impact, and those, if you're interested in that, which is getting funding to where it wouldn't otherwise go because of market failure, then then you basically looking at venture capital funds. That's investing in new companies. Private equity is another way of doing it, and also impact bonds, which have been mentioned, is considered like this, and blended finance. So that's all that you've already heard about today. And what I would want to say, though, is there aren't many. This is not a new asset class or instrument. This is very common. It's just what's not new. What is not common is this kind of instrument focused on a conflict context. And what I will talk about later are two examples which are not PeaceNexus's examples. They're other examples, but I thought they might be more relevant to those NGOs that are looking for new ways of raising funding. So I will talk to two examples later. In contrast with that, what the Peace Investment Fund that we helped seed fund and create does is, this is again not a new instrument. It's an engagement fund, and what that fund does is invests in liquid equities. In other words, stocks and shares of listed companies. So there, what you're trying to do is not necessarily the impact you're claiming is not that it's not the result of the company's action itself. It's not the number of jobs they have, etc. It's the fact that by engaging with the company that you're invested in, you have changed their behavior in some way that's peace promoting. So you're not necessarily only investing in companies that are peace builders. They can have different range of activities, but by engaging, you're improving their performance. And I just want to say, it's a growing field in general, sort of impact investing, and there's now serious research being done on the impact, and which is necessary in a phase of lots of greenwashing, and on both of these types of impact, there is a relatively strong evidence base. So if you want a very transformative impact in a region, it's probably through the impact investing, and that relatively little money goes into that. Whereas there is a strong evidence that through engagement with companies, you can get incremental change. Like, you'll never get a company to do a 180 degrees turn or do something that's very costly, but there is a lot of evidence for engagement changing, elements of how a big company works. So that's what the impact is. So that's really just to lay the groundwork. The fund that we helped set up, basically what we did is we created a screen or a filter to assess a kind of the potential number of companies you could invest in. And what we wanted to know is, are these global big companies, do they have a big impact in fragile places? So do they have an economic footprint there? And then we created an index to kind of look at the performance-based screening. And so then you get to, your investable companies, a few hundred, and then your asset manager chooses the ones that are most profitable from those. And those are the ones you then engage with. And once again, to clear, what your impact claim is not the impact of the companies, it's the impact of your engagement with the company to improve their performance. And here this is the slide I'm going to skip, but basically it shows how we do the screening. We can come back if there's time later. This is to say when we engage, and we is both a company and a foundation engage with the fund, the companies. We do a number of things, which is on the left. Basically awareness raising plus deep dive discussions where they have challenges, plus in some cases concrete collaboration. And the items on the right, are just illustrative examples of where, following our engagement with companies, companies have wanted support. And as our model, what our model is we can help identify the need and what could be done, and then the company takes over and actually commissions the support they need. So we basically go through the assessment together with the company pro bono, and then they carry on. So I'm just saying that in this 2 to 3 years that we've been doing this, there is evidence that companies are interested in these peace-related themes, and it just shows up differently depending on the kind of company. So that's our experience. Oops, sorry. It's got a double heading here. So this is now a slide that wasn't produced for me and by me, so I actually won't speak directly to it, but I want to explain, maybe I should go back to help you understand. What I'm going to talk about now is this Peace Dividend Initiative. Now, this is a very classic venture capital fund plan. It's actually not yet created, but the idea is to have a pipeline of projects and small companies that can be funded, but in a post-conflict situation. So basically, it's already been guaranteed by, well, it's not yet fully done, but it's a blended instrument where the Swiss government will contribute to de-risking it. And then you will have this fund of 100 million or so, and it will invest in a number of countries. I think they're looking at Mozambique as the first place. Number of companies, not countries, sorry. And then as the companies, mature and get sold, then the returns come back. But again, it's de-risked in some way. And I think it's the first one that I know of that is very explicitly, by its name, Peace Dividend Initiative, is in a kind of post-conflict situation. And then finally, I feel woefully inequipped to do this, because this is a new peace bond that is being created by Interpeace, and the feasibility study is about to be completed and published. In the absence of that, I'm kind of regurgitating what I've heard from colleagues in Interpeace. Basically, what is the plan here is innovative, that I understand, is this is a peace bond, which is basically a debt instrument. In other words, they are going to show that they're going to be able to fund kind of what they call peace enhancing mechanisms, which is a number of activities that is associated with peace building, whether it be dialogue mechanisms or social work towards social cohesion in the communities around a big development project. But the way they're going to be able to fund that is by saying to the banks that provide the capital for that big project, that by doing this, they're going to reduce the risks associated with the project. So the capital is cheaper. And maybe this is the best way of showing it. So the whole idea of this collaboration is that by injecting these peace building activities around a big project, the highlighted bit there is the key bit, is that you actually reduce the cost of the debt financing sufficiently to be able to pay for the peace building, confidence building, and community kind of cohesion around the project. So again, it's a collaboration between the bank that's providing the debt and then you need a third party as well to verify, kind of, I guess, the reduced risk. I don't know how they'll measure it exactly, and as well as other creditors. So I feel very insecure in giving you the details of that because I frankly don't know. But again, it's in the pipeline, and as to your point, Mark, I think this kind of instrument does need to be big, given that the complexity of setting it up. I think you're talking about hundreds of millions, and of course, if you're just reducing the risk by a small fraction in that, you still have a significant amount to give to the activity. So it's a bigger kind of venture. Those were 3 examples of new instruments in this field.
Katrina, thank you so much. I think you've opened my eyes to innovations that are really kind of stretching the imagination in different ways. I appreciate you've emphasized, some of these instruments have been around for a long time, but it's the kind of application, the creative application of them to sort of peace building and conflict contexts that I think is fascinating. I've understood more deeply the difference between impact investing and shareholder engagement. I think the prospect, the risk of peace washing as an emerging issue for us to be aware of and mitigate is something we should have in our minds, and that probably comes back to the same effort around proof of impact and measurability of outcomes, and having a robust evidence base for that. I'm wondering why there is it seems to me a kind of happy coincidence between, on the one hand, desired peace impacts and the actual higher rate of return on investments, above the market average. And it can't only be that the fund manager in, say, the Cadmos fund are extremely good at their job, above average. There's something going on there, and I'm guessing it's to do with these environments being risky environments, and therefore if you do the due diligence, back to Darshita's phrase, and you identify good prospects and then kind of double down on them with these investments, then you're likely to have higher than average returns. So that's my simplistic interpretation. Am I along the right lines?
Well, you could definitely pitch it that a well-managed company, and you get this with ESG as well. So the companies that have high ratings, you can argue, are more resilient. But it very much depends on, in our case, for example, because we were looking at net positive impact and we were looking at various data, we actually ended up having very few mining companies, extractive companies. So that's also it also depends on the sector you have in there, so that will affect returns. But it's a longer. There's not a straightforward correlation between contribution to peace building and returns.
Yeah, and I love the last example. That was really creative, where it's the savings on the cost of debt by reducing risk that actually pays for the peace building activities that help reduce the risk. I think that's just brilliant. So thanks, Katrina, for sharing all those different examples and opening our minds beyond just the impact bonds. We're going to turn now, last but not least, to welcome Sebastian Chaskel. Sebastian is an associate partner at Instiglio, Instiglio catalyzes more effective public and development spending by pushing the frontiers of innovative financing, experimenting with new approaches, and sharing the expertise, design frameworks, and other insights, including through publications such as a guide for effective results-based financing strategies. That sounds like good bedtime reading for all of us. Sebastian is going to share examples from Instiglio's work that goes much broader than just the peace building sector, and sharing different design frameworks and insights that I'm looking forward to learning from. So Sebastian, a very warm welcome, and over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. And thank you to the Alliance for Peace Building for accepting our panel, and to Mark for inviting us and for pulling all of this together. I realize it was a lot of work, and it's just wonderful to be on such a great panel on innovative finance for peace building. So as Mark mentioned, I'm with Instiglio. We're a nonprofit organization. Our 10-year birthday is actually this week. We're about to celebrate it tomorrow. And our mission is to support our partners in moving toward a world in which every cent spent on delivering social programs has the greatest possible impact. We're based in Colombia, and we work mostly across Latin America and Africa. And today I'm going to speak about results-based financing. I'm going to often just refer to it as RBF, which is a subset of innovative financing, and it is our focus at Instiglio. So I appreciated earlier during Emily's presentation, hearing about the outcomes your organizations work to achieve. And I saw, improving psychosocial well-being, increases in trust, increases in participation of underrepresented groups. And I understand that all of these are closer to outcomes. So in my mind, they would be among the items that would appear on the right of your theory of change, where results and outcomes are, and not towards the left of the theory of change, where your inputs may be. But I imagine that your revenue sources, if you're working for organizations that are implementing these programs, they likely are not paying for verifiable outcomes, like the ones that you mentioned, because most governments, foundations, donors do not. Instead, they pay for something further on the left of the theory of change, such as completed workshops or number of program participants. And as I imagine many of us in this virtual room have probably experienced, this type of funding for activities and inputs can be problematic for a couple of reasons. On the one end, it forces implementing agencies to run a program in a certain pre-established way, even if you're seeing on the ground that you may not be having the best impact, and you know that there are innovations, that there are changes you could do that would improve impact. They leave you with little flexibility. And on the other end, for those paying for the programs, they are also not getting what they expect to get out of it. They're not getting the outcomes they perhaps are hoping that they'll achieve, because they've given you a specific recipe of how to put it together, and they're not giving you the flexibility to change. So RBF, results-based financing, simply responds to these limitations by moving away from paying for something on the left of the theory of change inputs, and rather paying for something further on the right, and paying specifically for verified results. This means that the payments are tied this basically is a way of ensuring that the good intentions are not just good intentions, but are actually leading to results. And in our experience in the past 10 years, when we've worked with organizations supporting them in using RBF, we've seen that this can really be transformational for an implementing organization for 4 different reasons, which I've outlined here. The first one, which is similar to something Emily mentioned, is it really draws attention to outcomes. So we've seen that when organizations are working with a donor or a government that is really paying for results, the conversation switches from show me the number of people you work with, so show me the sign-up sheet or something like that, to really show me, how do we know that we actually achieve this impact? Is it verifiable? How do I know that I'm actually paying for results? The second one, which I alluded to earlier, is just the flexibility you get. Flexibility to recognize what's working and what's not, and do more of what's working and stop doing what's not. So it really allows you to innovate a lot more. And the third one has to do with simply aligning the financial incentives with participant welfare. So now how much you are getting paid as an implementer really depends on how much impact you're having on the end beneficiary of your program. So it really aligns the incentives of the implementing organization, the donor, and the participant at the end. And in that way also creates accountability for participants in the way that you have to record information for this to work, and make it public. So today I want to share with you one example, which is the Educate Girls Development Impact Bond, which was the first impact bond in a lower middle income country. This is an impact bond that we designed in 2015. And it had two goals. The first one was to increase enrollment or to decrease dropouts among girls. And the second one was to increase learning scores among boys and girls in Rajasthan in India. The intervention was therefore twofold. The first one was focused on enrollment, which was door-to-door visits to prevent dropouts. And the second one was a learning curriculum developed by volunteers. This is what an impact bond looks like. So this is similar to the image Emily showed earlier for an impact bond in the humanitarian space. So here you see Educate Girls on the right. They're the service provider delivering the intervention. ID Insight is at the bottom. They're the impact evaluator. Their job is to notify everyone of what impact was achieved. Educate Girls received funding initially here from UBS Optimus Foundation, which is the investor. And then the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, CIF, they're going to pay back UBS Optimus Foundation for their investment. And they may pay the entire amount plus a return. They may pay a partial amount, or they may not pay at all, depending on the results that ID Insight identified. And UBS Optimus is passing on some of those outcome payments to Educate Girls. And in that way, Educate Girls also has a financial return, depending on the success of their program. I'm happy to share a link right after this session or right after I speak on the chat with the results of this impact bond. But in short, Educate Girls was able to achieve pretty impressive results. In this one indicator I'm showing here, 60% above the target that was set for them. So why do we think this was successful? First, Educate Girls already had a high-performing field team. They had they already had existing monitoring and evaluation tools, and therefore we had data to reference its past performance and understand how far perhaps it could be pushed through an impact bond. Second, the devil's a bit in the details. The impact bond was very carefully designed to manage and avoid perverse incentives. The targets were realistic but ambitious, and there was transparency about the targets across the organization. So developing these specifics about design correctly in order to incentivize impact is very important. And the last one is Educate Girls was also given the right flexibility to push for outcomes. So there were certain aspects that had to remain as part of the program, the two sort of intervention models I showed earlier, but within that there was quite a bit of flexibility. So you might be wondering, okay, so is results-based financing, right for me as an organization? So the first thing I'd like to mention is impact bonds, which Emily and I have focused on quite a bit today. They're only one of many different instruments that you can use when it comes to results-based financing. And I thought it was interesting, Emily, I think mentioned there were only around 200 impact bonds that ever developed with a total of around $500 million. In total, in the past 20 years, we believe that there's been around $20 billion paid in RBF mechanisms in the past 20 years. So in this sense, impact bonds are a small share of the pie. I think perhaps they attract attention because they attract private investors. But note that if you're an implementing organization and you do an impact bond, not only do you have to attract private investors, you also have to attract an outcome payer that will pay back the private investor if you achieve that effect. And some of these other tools here, they require an outcome payer, but they don't require an impact investor, and they don't require such a complex financial mechanism. So some of the other RBF mechanisms here, I think could actually be attractive to some other organizations that perhaps initially think that impact bonds may be the right way to go for them. So the first ones on the top in the slide are really about mechanisms for government. I would focus on the bottom three, which I think are the most relevant if you're NGOs, implementing organizations in the room. The bottom one we discussed, impact bonds, but the two above those I'd like to mention. So price-based challenges is simply when a donor comes up with an open bid and says we're going to award it to whoever comes up with the best invention developed within a certain set of time. This is something that might make sense for a problem for which we don't know what the right solution might be, and you want to incentivize that innovation. I sometimes think about it as somewhat similar to the way we saw that vaccines for COVID-19 were developed, by in a way promising to pay for something if it's developed in the end. The one above that is more around implementation, performance-based contracts or grants. So here what we're saying is something quite similar to the impact bond I presented on Educate Girls, but without the investor. Simply the outcome funder saying we're going to give funding to the implementing partner based on the results they achieve. And it's often not 100%, because if it were 100%, it might be too much of a risk for the implementing organization to take on. But it could be a certain percentage that allows the implementing organization to absorb some of the risk, but perhaps not the entire amount. It could also be a prize-based, like it could be something on top of the cost of the intervention. And in that way, the donor is the one who's actually taking the risk a bit rather than the implementing organization. So if you were to approach us and say, hey, you know, are we in a place where we're ready for an impact bond? And if so, how do we move forward? The first thing we would do is an analysis of, does results-based financing really add value in your situation? So what are the constraints to achieving your impact? And is this something that results-based financing can solve? In some cases, it may be. In some cases, it may not be. Mark, how am I doing on time? Just double checking.
You're good if you want another minute or two, Sebastian.
Okay. So maybe I'll show this one and then jump to some final conclusions. So the first thing we would ask is just, does RBF add value? And if not, perhaps you shouldn't do it. If it does, then let's move forward. The second one is conditions for results-based financing. So do you have the right data environment? Do you have the right partners in the room? That, if you don't have it, we actually think we can build it. And we often work with organizations to build that environment by working with them on their performance management systems or by bringing the right actors into the room. Once we have that, we would go into selecting the right instrument. So is it an impact bond? Is it something else? Designing it, as I was mentioning, the devil's in the details. And then lastly, thinking about beyond this specific instrument, how is RBF going to be helpful in the long run? So sometimes we reach a conclusion where an impact bond may be right for now, but after you've done one impact bond and you've seen what kind of success you can achieve, perhaps then you can jump into a performance-based grant, because you as an implementer now have a much better sense of the impact you can have, and you can absorb some of the risk, which at the beginning you were not able to do. So just some quick takeaways, and I'll finish up. So the first one is, go down the RBF path only if your interests are really well aligned. So if you're very interested in fundraising, but not necessarily in sort of this big push for impact, I think there must be more efficient ways to fundraise than to go down this path. So I think this is a path that's useful if you really want to sort of push for greater impact for your organization, but not necessarily the most efficient path if you're just looking to fundraise. The second one is make sure you have added value with RBF from the outset. If you don't have it, don't do it. But if the conditions aren't there, then you may still want to think about developing them. I wouldn't just stop if you don't have all the right conditions. The third one is just bring the donors along with you on the journey. Don't expect that they'll be there at the end if you develop the instrument. We've seen instruments that are created where in the end you just don't have the outcome payers and you're stuck with having made an investment and no one to pay for it. So bring them along. And the last one is, you're not alone. A lot of organizations have gone through this. There's organizations like ours that have quite a bit of knowledge about this. We do make it all public. So I'll post also links to the guidebook that Mark mentioned at the beginning. But there's quite a bit of knowledge that has been accumulated, a strong community of practice. So we're all here to help. No need to do it on your own. That's it. Thank you so much, Mark.
Sebastian, that was superb. Thank you again for kind of broadening our minds beyond the peace building bubble to lots of other examples, and also broadening beyond the kind of high visibility of impact bonds to a reminder of the much larger results-based financing modalities. I think we're seeing the advantages of all of these innovations are shifting the energy of the system towards where it really should be, towards results, and focusing on outcomes, not on inputs and outputs. And I think you highlighted the kind of that unleashes the flexibility. And I think for a lot of us, especially with kind of more traditional grant-based funding, so much energy in the system on the donor and on the recipient goes into the bureaucracy of inputs and outputs, and so much proportionately less energy goes to what we all want to be achieving at the outcome end of the theory of change. So I think that was very nicely put. You also emphasized accountability to beneficiaries, and that was an angle that I hadn't thought of before, but I can see how just the focus on results and what really matters to beneficiaries or directly to participants, that's a really good additional sort of positive outcome. One question for you, Sebastian, is if I understood correctly in your introduction, Instiglio is itself a non-profit, and you've clearly got some fantastic expertise that's available and sort of on offer. What is the typical sort of funding and sort of contractual relationship if you get inundated now with people sending emails to the email on their screens here? What's the typical relationship with a non-profit organization, whether it's Peacebuilding or in any other sector?
Great, thanks, Mark. So yes, we're a non-profit, and our model is usually two components. One is consultancy, so we work directly with implementing organizations on a fee-for-service basis, looking at these types of opportunities. We're also hoping to increasingly receive grant funding so that we can provide these services either at a reduced cost or pro bono to the organizations that are seeking these services. That's one way, and the second way is just we produce a lot of information which we make public. So I'll post those links in a second. But there's a guidebook, for example, that we worked on with the World Bank, and there's other documents that we've published that are on our website with steps on how to think about this and also how to engage in the RBF space if it's your first time.
That's fantastic. So yes, I would encourage everyone listening to take a look back at the chat. There's already some links for other resources, and maybe stay on when we close out the session at past, just to make sure you've captured those links before we close down the presentation. We've got about 13-14 minutes for questions, and I see some questions in the chat. So I'd like perhaps to call upon Craig Zelizer. Craig, great that you're on this session. It's wonderful to connect with you again. It's been many years, and you mentioned some experience, some personal experience of your own on angel investing. So I wonder if you could share just a minute or two max on your own experiences, in case that adds another case study, another example to this conversation. I hope Craig's still with us. Perhaps he has dropped off.
He's asking if
how does he come online? Sorry. Yes, that is a good question. Aishwarya, are we able to give Craig audio?
Yeah, just give me a minute. He needs to make himself live in order to be seen and heard.
Okay, I wonder if in the chat you'd be able to help Craig with that. And return to another question. I see Laura Desher has a very good question, effectively around what happens when projects fail. So if all the focus is on results, but you don't get the results you promised, have there been examples of that in your experience, and how does it work?
I think her question was actually different than that. So I'll answer again her question, but I'll answer your question too, Mark.
Yeah, please, Emily, go ahead. Yeah.
Was sort of the failure, I think, what I understood was, are there outcome funders who don't pay even if outcomes were achieved, i.e. are they sort of defaulting on their promise to pay? That has not happened. There are 2 impact bonds that did not achieve the outcomes that they were meant to achieve, and so the investors did not get their full payment. There are others that partial payment was made, and one impact bond that closed during the pandemic, ended early during the pandemic. We have a series of policy briefs in our Brookings research that can be found in the link that Sarah put in, where we measure 5 dimensions of the success of impact bonds. And in the third policy brief in that series, the third policy brief looks at measuring outcomes and investor repayment. And so that was published, in 2020. Not a lot has happened since then, but that gives a sense for sort of the success so far, both in terms of outcome achievement investment, repayment, as well as the other 4 dimensions of success that we measure in that series.
Thank you so much, Emily. Sebastian, do you have examples of sort of failures to achieve results as well?
I'm not sure I have any other examples, but I would just say, even if you don't achieve results, that can still be a success in a way for the mechanism, right? Like, part of what we're hoping to is identify what works and what doesn't, and ensure that we are creating a market around it. So even though it's disappointing, of course, if you don't, it's a part of what you would expect, and sort of natural part of the results ecosystem.
So just before we turn to Craig,
not good for the beneficiaries or the investors, but for the outcome funder, who doesn't have to pay for outcomes that aren't achieved.
Right. So that, I mean, a related question just before we turn to Craig. I guess with any system like this, there's the potential. It all looks nice on paper and with a kind of nice logical flow diagram, but there's plenty of scope for game playing and sort of other kind of more negative systemic forces kind of crushing the system. And I'm particularly thinking of the role of these sort of third-party evaluators. So has that any experiences to share on that? Do they come under pressure? How is that integrity of that piece maintained in order to ensure the whole system works? That could be for Emily or Sebastian or Katrina or Darshita.
Perhaps one quick comment on that is, again, it's sort of the devil's in the details and how this is designed. So at the beginning of the impact bond, this is put into writing exactly how the evaluation will work, exactly what indicators are required, and also contingency plans. So during the pandemic was challenging for many of the open operations, as you can imagine. Some of the interventions did not go as planned. For example, we were working on an impact bond on employment in Colombia. You can imagine what happened. And for all of those types of situations, you need to have them laid out just as you would in any financial mechanism. So it's important to be very rigorous and to play out all of those scenarios at the beginning.
Which I presume means a lot of lawyers are involved at that stage as well.
There are lawyers involved.
Okay, let's turn to Craig then. Craig, if you're able to share what you alluded to in the chat, some interesting personal experiences of the angel investing in this space. Craig, you're on mute. Not yet. You may need to press another unmute button. Let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we got you.
Thanks, Mark, and nice to see everybody. So I just wanted to share, we've gotten really into, my wife and I, we live in Medellin, we've gotten very much into angel investing for impact. And so one of the challenges I find is all the talk of results-based financing is often macro level, it's talking about hundreds, tens of millions of dollars. And one of the things I found is that there are so many startups working in the social impact space that need pre-seed, seed, Series A capital. And we've invested in, I'm talking about $1,000 checks, and you can even do it, there's certain accreditation you need, but you can also do it directly through other platforms. And most of them are not working on peace building, but a lot of them are working on issues that directly or indirectly would be contributing to peace. And I'm talking about reducing gender-based violence, working in migration, fintech, And so I think one of the areas that this field is really missing, because I talk to a lot of leaders in the field, and most of them don't even think about this. So you don't necessarily have to be putting together deals that are worth 10 to 20 or $100 million. It's also like looking at startups, and we invest in Colombia. One of the most exciting startups we invested in did fail. There's a high failure rate, but it was working using blockchain to do remittances for Venezuelan migrants to send it back to Venezuela. So I'm just saying there's so much going on in that space, both at the small level, but also there's startups that are across societies that are doing this work, and that's an area I've seen a lot of discussion, but I'm not finding many people in the space who are coming from the peace building sector. So.
Very good, Craig. Thanks for sharing that experience. And yes, just a reminder that small scale stuff can make a significant difference on the ground. For me, I wonder, is there a sort of bridge and intersection between microfinancing projects and small scale results based financing? Are they similar animals, or are they significantly different? Don't know if anyone on our panel is directly involved in any microfinance projects.
I can just share briefly on microfinance. Generally, the idea is that you invest directly into the beneficiary. You give them the finance they need to get up and running on their feet, and then they pay you back through the way they generate money with the asset. So it's slightly different to bonds or any other form of financing, where generally it's not a precedent where financing directly goes to the beneficiary. So in that way, they're a bit different.
True. You could perhaps have them linked, so maybe the bond would pay for the microfinance loans. I'm interested in that small scale stuff.
100%. I think the one example I was going to give at the end was the importance for nonprofits to think about corporate partnerships, because if they can align themselves within the corporate value chain, corporates are now looking to demonstrate they add value to society, and peace building efforts can really join efforts just because they have a network of people who need support. The beneficiaries need some kind of support. So I think if you can start aligning with for-profit or corporate partners, it's easier, because corporates will do the fundraise for you in some ways, and you just have to focus on delivering a really good quality outcome.
Yeah, so as long as you can overcome those barriers of the due diligence and proof of impact, then you have a much better chance. I really want to thank our panelists and thank our audience. We're just coming up on time. So as we close out, I'd like to invite each of our panelists very briefly just to share any sort of closing takeaway. So let me turn to Emily for a quick takeaway. Emily.
Sure. It was really a pleasure, and I was especially interested to see all of the potential outcomes. And I think that I just want to sort of re-emphasize what you said, Mark, about thinking about those outcomes. How can they be made concrete, and really considering what are the challenges that you're facing in the peace building sector, and can innovative financing mechanisms like results-based financing or impact bonds in particular be a way to address some of those challenges. So and just also in terms of scale, I think the goal is scale. So perhaps looking at initially testing the waters a little bit with pilots, but the goal is scale. I think that's the most most efficient way to go about this. So yeah, great conversation, and looking forward to hearing more.
Thanks so much. Brilliant to have you. And I would encourage everyone to go onto the Brookings Institution website and read the series of papers done by Emily and her team. Thanks, Sarah, also for supporting the poll. That was really great to have that visibility at the beginning. Let's turn to Darshita. Darshita, your closing takeaway?
My closing takeaway is the importance of a forum like this, where you actually get the opportunity to step back, evaluate, think about things you're not thinking. And I think even a conference like this in itself fosters scale, fosters innovation, unlocks opportunities. So that's my takeaway. Thanks.
So this counts as at least the beginnings of game-changing collaboration, we hope. Darshita, thanks so much, and really appreciate your presentation. Let's turn next to Katrina. Katrina, your closing takeaway.
I guess I think you said it's revisiting innovative finance, but I do think this is a moment where the kind of social inclusion and measuring its moment has come. And I noticed that because on the company side, even like we get requests for social inclusion targets. They've never thought about it before, but they want to measure it. And then also regulation, EU regulation, this so-called social taxonomy has a social inclusion and communities new category. So everybody's struggling to think about how do we measure outcomes in this area. So I do think that now it's not an accident why we have this panel, and there have been a few others around, because it's NGOs, but also and donors and corporates even thinking about how to measure this now.
Very good. Now is the time. So yeah, I really appreciate your inputs, and Katrina, especially sharing the other examples beyond your direct involvement with PeaceNexus and the Cadmos Fund.
Yeah, I apologize to those colleagues in advance for having butchered a pitch.
But it really opened our mind to kind of diversity. That was excellent. Thanks for that. And last but not least, Sebastian, your closing takeaway.
Great. So I saw someone asked in the chat, are there good examples of peace building organizations using RBF instruments? And I think Emily responded saying, well, if you consider the ones with refugees and humanitarian context as part of that, then yes. But beyond that, I think it's hard to think of examples. And I'm not really sure why that is. I think a part of it might be the early results-based financing instruments were perhaps along the lower hanging fruit. In sectors that perhaps were more easy to measure, such as employability, education, but that doesn't mean that that's what they're limited for. And as you were mentioning, Mark, it would be a big step forward if for peace building we could move from the types of contracts and grants that are perhaps more about the bureaucracy, about the counting numbers of sessions, and more about the focus on impact. So I would just encourage everyone in the room to keep on moving down this path of working on, getting towards outcomes. And of course, we'd be very happy to continue the conversation offline afterwards.
Superb. Here, Sebastian, thank you. I really want to echo that. I hope this session has been the beginning of lots of new conversations, some game-changing collaboration, some new links. I really want to thank all of our panelists for coming together, putting a lot of thought and effort into your presentations, and I'm delighted how there's been a sort of logical flow and connections, and lots of diversity that I think has expanded not just our knowledge but our sort of imagination about things that might be possible for the peace building field, and now is certainly the time to get exploring these more seriously. So huge thanks also to Alliance for Peacebuilding for allowing this session in what has been an incredibly busy and fascinating schedule for PeaceCon 10. And on the technical side, I really want to thank Saurav and Aishwarya for the technical support from Alliance for Peacebuilding team with the Visibo platform. Last but not least, to our audience, huge thanks for joining us. Great to have big numbers in the session. It shows we may be striking a chord. The topic is of interest. Let's continue the conversations from here. Thank you all very much.